Imagine this. You're 12 years old, and one night, your body starts to change. Hair starts to sprout in strange new places. Your bones start to grow and shift. Your muscles start to bulk up, and your voice starts to drop into a strange, deep sound you can barely recognize. And then you realize you're turning into a werewolf. Even if puberty doesn't literally cause you to turn into a monster, like in the 2000 film Ginger Snaps, where the main character Ginger turns into a werewolf.
I just got the curse.
Puberty can feel really scary. Now, a lot of kids' film and TV portray it in a way that you have to come to and accept puberty, like Pixar's film Turning Red, where a young cisgender girl embraces her womanhood.
This is our first step into womanhood.
But for transgender people, they're taking them in the opposite direction that they see themselves.
Your own body screws you.
A trans girl who may have previously been comfortable with her body going through a male puberty will now experience irreversible changes to their body that will trigger massive gender dysphoria potentially for the rest of her life. Luckily, there's ways to deal with this. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about transgender affirming healthcare, puberty blockers, and the political and medical discussion around them. So stay tuned. Puberty is scary.
I'm a gross red monster!
Even scarier are the recent attacks, though, on transgender youth's ability to access gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers. So the purpose of puberty blockers is for allowing a youth who experiences gender dysphoria during puberty and may identify as transgender a chance to figure out their gender identity, figure out what it would be like to live in the world according to that gender identity, and determine to the best of their ability over time whether they indeed are transgender and wish to seek further treatments, which may not be reversible. Puberty blockers, however, are fully reversible, and they give that youth and their parents time to figure out if other procedures like hormone replacement therapy or surgery will be right for that child, and give that child extra years to become an adult and be able to give informed consent about other treatments. So often, the first argument you'll hear time and time again about puberty blockers is that they are irreversible. This is false. It's false because all the medical science shows that someone who goes on puberty blockers will resume normal puberty as soon as they're out of that person's system. That means that person will be able to reproduce, they will not be infertile, as opponents claim, and they'll develop the same bone growth, musculature, and changes in the body that they would normally for their birth sex. For a cisgender assigned female at birth person, they would then resume things like breast growth and menstruation. Puberty blockers, furthermore, again, delay the decision so that someone can have informed consent about later procedures. Puberty blockers are only prescribed according to a period in someone's development in which they've already developed sex cells, i.e. eggs or sperm, and in which those can be preserved. So that way, a child, as they become an adult and want to consent to hormone replacement therapy, which can make one infertile, they will already have preserved their ability to reproduce. One other thing you won't hear is that more cisgender youth take puberty blockers for reasons completely unrelated to gender identity than trans youth do. Puberty blockers were developed to treat something often referred to as precocious puberty. Basically, girls who developed breast growth and menstruation earlier than their peers, boys who developed earlier, although it's more likely that girls will be prescribed them. And as a result, these have been used for decades, also for intersex people. So we have a lot of research, decades of it, on the safety of puberty blockers. So the arguments that somehow that this is a new science are misleading. Yes, it's new that a lot of transgender people are being treated with puberty blockers, but we already know the effects of them. In fact, organizations like WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, have guidelines going back decades known as the Standards of Care, which are actually pretty conservative in their recommendations for if and when transgender people should have access to things like hormones, puberty blockers, and surgeries. And there is a multi-year evaluation process between each step. But ultimately, every major medical organization in the United States endorses puberty blockers for trans youth and youth who think they might be trans as the first step in a possible gender transition. Possible. Again, remember that the puberty blockers allow someone to delay the decision and figure out, like any teen, what feels right for them. Because the world is a confusing and scary and difficult place to navigate, especially if you have questions about your gender, and puberty blockers give you a chance to figure that out. When conservative lawmakers and trans exclusionary radical feminists try to pass bills to ban gender-affirming care for youth, they're not doing so out of the best interest of the child or their parents. They're taking away the ability for parents and youth to make decisions about their own body and saying, I know better than you do. And these bills to ban gender-affirming healthcare for youth aren't really about protecting anyone. They're about riling up a transphobic, white supremacist base who wants a scapegoat, trans people, to vilify. Right now, healthcare for trans youth is under attack at state houses across the country. There are at least 25 bills to restrict or outright block the ability for trans youth to access gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy. This is in addition to states which already have policies and regulations in place trying to stop trans youth and their parents and medical providers from accessing gender-affirming and providing gender-affirming healthcare. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott recently ordered investigations into parents and licensed facilities that provide standard medical care to transgender teenagers as child abuse, essentially trying to take trans youth away from trans-affirming parents simply because those parents were trying to provide healthcare according to medically recommended guidelines for trans youth. These laws are also modeled on existing anti-abortion legislation, and arguments used to promote them are intended to appeal to politicians' existing religiously conservative, pro-life, anti-abortion voter base. For example, in Idaho, which is trying to pass even harsher restrictions for trans health care than Texas, including up to life in prison for medical providers and parents who help trans kids access health care, Republican State Representative Julian Young called her state legislators' proposed ban on trans-affirming health care an extension of her pro-life beliefs, and said, "We are not talking about the life of the child, but we are talking about the potential to give life to another generation." let that sink in. Representative Young, her priority is not saving the life of a trans child, which is especially alarming given the fact that it's been shown that trans youth who don't have access to gender-affirming care, who don't have supportive parents or communities, are at a heightened risk of suicide. I mean, the 2020 U.S. mental health survey done by the Trevor Project found that 40% of trans youth had considered attempting suicide in the previous year. So Representative Julianne Young from Idaho cares more about the potential future fertility of a trans person than that person's ability to live a happy and healthy life. Meanwhile, ignoring everything I just said about the science, that if you can preserve someone's sex cells, reproductive sperm or eggs, before you begin hormone replacement therapy, they can still have children. But that's not ultimately what this is about. They whip up a moral panic about how this discriminatory and harmful legislation is necessary to combat an epidemic of trans people and trans youth on puberty blockers and gender-affirming care. So to back up these arguments, they'll ignore decades of existing science that I've discussed, but instead use hyperbolic and conspiratorial arguments comparing prescribing puberty blockers to youth as experimenting on youth like in Nazis experimenting on Jews in concentration camps. Yet these same people who bring up metaphors from the Holocaust will use anti-Semitic language blaming a conspiracy of billionaire Jews for funding the trans agenda so that they can greedily make profit off of pharmaceutical companies that are making these puberty blockers. Meanwhile, these puberty blockers, more of them are going to cis youth and trans youth. They're not like brand name drugs that are making a lot of money. And this whole thing is anti-Semitic and leads to the very Nazi concentration camps that these TERFs and conservatives are somehow comparing gender-affirming care to. Furthermore, their arguments will rely on white supremacist ideas like the Great Replacement theory, that white women need to make more babies so that they aren't outpaced by the babies made by people of color and Muslims and Jews and immigrants coming into the country, that they must do something to preserve the white race from being replaced. And TERFs and conservatives display incredibly patronizing attitudes towards trans boys and trans men, calling them confused girls and claiming they're protecting their fertility by forcing them to go through a female puberty they don't want. And they really only care, if you look at the news and what they talk about white trans people who they feel are girls, confused girls and women who are actually trans boys and non-binary transmasculine people. And this idea that trans exclusionary radical feminists are somehow protecting the fertility of young trans men by preventing them from transitioning is where they strike an unlikely alliance with pro-life, anti-abortion, anti-feminists, because they want to ensure that the state can control young people's lives. So that's the political situation, but what are the rest of the facts? So first, I want to point you to a January 2022 Psychology Today meta-review of 16 major medical studies of gender-affirming healthcare. But to look at one of the more recent, a 2020 Dutch study, this one compared 272 transgender adolescents referred to a gender clinic who had not yet received puberty-suppressing medication, puberty blockers, with 178 transgender adolescents who had received puberty blockers. They found that those who had received puberty blockers had better mental health outcomes than those who did not. In other words, what they're saying is that puberty suppressors are safe, and that if a youth has access to them and access to medical providers that will help them through the transition process and monitor their health, they will have as good mental health as cisgender people, because they'll be able to go through a quote-unquote normal adolescence that matches their gender, and they'll be happier. And with supportive parents and supportive providers, they won't have to, as the Trevor Project 2020 survey showed, have a 40% rate of suicidal ideation, or as the 2015 US Trans Survey showed, 43% of trans people had attempted suicide in their lifetime. Yet a conservative and trans-exclusionary radical feminist TERF talking point is that there are all these studies out there showing that trans-affirming healthcare is damaging or bad, and there actually aren't. In fact, one of the only studies that they ever cite is the 2018 paper by Dr. Lisa Littman, which put forward the theory that transgender identity is a form of social contagion, that young gender nonconforming and gay/lesbian kids are being socially pressured into transitioning, and Dr. Lisa Littman uses the term rapid-onset gender dysphoria. Now, rapid-onset gender dysphoria, ROGD, is not something you'll find in any medical diagnosis guideline, textbook, because it's fake. The paper was immediately discredited for severe methodological flaws, including the fact that no actual children or youth were studied. In fact, the research was done by posting a survey on message boards for parents who did not support their trans youth and who already believed in this social contagion theory. And so it was a biased sample asking people who already believed in this theory if this theory was real. It was withdrawn with an apology from the publisher, yet this myth of ROGD persists because it's a convenient argument. Another argument leveled against gender-affirming care, that people are being misidentified as transgender and later detransitioning at extremely high, record-breaking rates. Well, there is no quantitative evidence to suggest that a large number of individuals are detransitioning. The available evidence does not suggest that puberty suppression causes transgender identity to persist. Delaying transition until adulthood results in worse mental health outcomes that are likely to be permanent. Only a very small percentage of transgender adolescents desist, thus making puberty suppression blockers the safest option. So, beginning of this video, I talked about how kids shows and movies often portray puberty as monstrous. And I wanted to weave more of this in to this video, but it was hard because the facts are really, really hard to talk about. But I love kids shows and movies that portray puberty as monstrous and make fun of it, because for me, puberty was awful. I'd rather watch a kid show where someone turns into a purple butterfly like Star. I actually cosplay her.
I think I'm going through puberty.
Or Glendale from Centaur World, who gets the ability to have a portal to another dimension in her stomach during puberty and can summon a Cthulhu-like demon.
Oh, bodies are interesting. You never know what is in store, no.
These are funny to me because puberty felt like being demonically possessed and having horrific, monstrous things happen to me. And I can laugh about it now. I mean, I'm 36, but the scars that I went through at age 13, 15 are still with me. I would do anything to go back in time and not have to go through a male puberty. And just to have been on puberty suppression and to go through life only having, one puberty instead of two, my second one being at age 20, I know I'd be happier. Which is why I'm so glad we have transgender people and advocates standing up for trans youth and saying that this isn't our destiny. We're not destined to go through a puberty that will harm our mental health, because now we have medicine that can change that. And I think that's great that as humans we have progressed to the point where, while transgender people have always existed, we now have medication that's going to help them live happier lives. And that's something to be celebrated, not something to be scared of. We can be scared of monsters like werewolves or the cute little fuzzy red panda monster from Turning Red.
Are you a werewolf? No! What?
But ultimately, we should be fighting those monsters if they're going to harm our kids. And that means getting our kids gender-affirming healthcare and not giving in to the false outrage about a transgender epidemic or that trans is a social contagion that is pushed by conservatives. We need to support trans youth. Please, if you can, support me on Patreon, because I'd love to bring more content to you and more fun content. Patreon.com/Kaylee Whalen. And if you can't support financially, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this video. And maybe you have some of your own thoughts you can leave in the comments section. What did you think of Turning Red? Did you like it? Love to hear from you.